Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Stranger of Paradise, a Final Fantasy Origin. I played on the Xbox Series X. It's also available on the Xbox Series S, Xbox One, PS4, PS5, and PC. So let's start with the story. You play as Jack, and he is just as generic looking as his name sounds. He is a stereotypically gruff and kind of angry at all times character. He, along with his cohorts Jed and Ash, were kind of tied up in this really weird story that I'm not going to go into because of, plot details, but they are wrapped up in trying to rid the world of chaos. But there's this weird space time travel kind of shit going on in the game that I don't necessarily love. And there are just weird little details throughout that I'm not entirely in love with, and I don't think the game does a great job describing and dealing with. So I'm going to say that right away. The story also just doesn't feel very Final Fantasy, considering it's supposed to be taking place in a Final Fantasy world. In some ways it captures it, but in a lot of ways it just feels just a little off. Now that being said, let's get into the audio, and one of the interesting things they did with the music is that it's kind of like remixes of songs you will recognize from other Final Fantasies. I definitely picked up on some Final Fantasy 13 in there, and just a few other ones where I was like, wait a second, I know this. It's not quite the same, but I know this. Which isn't a bad thing, it's actually kind of a good thing, considering this is a weird spin-off game. Then you've got the voiceover work, which is fine. None of it is amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but it works well enough, I guess. Some of it at times is a little lacking though. As for the sound effects, not that amazing either. There are definitely sound effects that are lacking. I never ran into any point where I was missing sound effects, but there were definitely times where the sound effects were just overly generic, so it was a little weird and just didn't quite work. Now let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and it's actually deeper than I thought and not what I was expecting, but it is a third-person action RPG, and the combat itself feels very Soulsborne-like. But I will say right away, it doesn't quite capture the Soulsborne vibe, because it's a little too easy to be a Soulsborne game, and at the same time, they definitely try to inject Final Fantasy elements into it, and I just don't know that they did an amazing job hybridizing the two. What they took from Soulsborne is that, that third-person action style, you have limited healing items, you reach certain points, and you can replenish items and health and stuff. And that's also where you spend your points leveling up. It's also more challenging than, your basic hack and slash. But what they took from Final Fantasy is the job class system, which I think is one of the cooler ideas that they took, as well as you have party members, and you get a total of 4 party members, and you can only have 2 at a time. And they each have their own job class as well, but you can do any job class you want. But it just doesn't capture that Soulsborne challenge in the same way, and it doesn't function quite as well as a Soulsborne game. As far as that really clean and perfect combat goes, you can use your party members to your advantage. There is a strategy around that depending on what class you're using. And the fact that if you die, you get wiped out and you go to the beginning. But they do it in their own way, and I do think to an extent it works. But throughout, I felt reminded of a Soulsborne game. And how the combat in a Soulsborne game is honestly better overall. Yes, I'm wearing different clothes because I had to record this after the fact. People may notice that I shit on Code Vein for this, but I am sitting there saying it's okay in Stranger of Paradise, and that is because in Code Vein, your teammate could literally just deal with the boss all by themselves. You did not need to be there. Whereas in Stranger of Paradise, yes, they probably could deal with the boss, but it would take an hour on their own. They are not so overly aggressive that they can just wreck a boss on their own. You do really need to participate in it to keep them alive, to actually do the finishing blows. They make you engage, whereas Code Vein, the problem with the teammate was they could just do the boss. You didn't even need to be there. All you had to do was avoid the boss. And honestly, once your teammate got going, they would go through the boss and the boss would focus on them. Whereas in Stranger of Paradise, even if you're off healing and your teammates are the ones fighting the boss will still turn their attention to you and come after you, putting you in danger, which didn't happen in Code Vein. Now, when it comes to the job system, I think that is done in an interesting manner because, like I said, you can do any job you want and you level up that job, and then that can lead to an advanced job, which you will also level up, which will lead to an expert job. job. Although to get the expert jobs and some of the advanced jobs, you have to level up multiple like basic jobs or multiple advanced jobs. One thing that I found weird was that some of the earlier jobs had massive advantages over some of the more advanced jobs. Like for example, the Dragoon, when you use Leap, it's a far more effective attack than the expert job Berserker, which uses Zangetsu, which no, does not wipe out everything. It's a giant, really slow swing. Or in the case of, God, I can't remember what it is, like the Caster versus the Black Mage, which is the more advanced position. The Black Mage can't regen their MP, but the less advanced version can. So stuff like that just felt weird in a balancing sense. You didn't feel like you were necessarily more powerful because you were using a more powerful class. So that was a little janky to me. The other thing this game adds that's kind of different from both Final Fantasy and a Soulsborne is the amount of loot you get. You get so much loot that you will end up just getting rid of huge amounts of it. So they mixed in a bit of that too, and it works fine, but it's also a very ignorable feature. I mean, yeah, you can upgrade your gear on a pretty consistent basis, but it gets a little pointless because none of that gear really feels super unique. While they do have their own unique stats, none of it really does feel like it's really unique from the one you had 5 levels ago or whatever it was. But I'm not going to sit here and say I hate the gameplay. I actually don't. I do feel that it's a little too reminiscent of Soulsborne games, but doesn't quite capture what Soulsborne games bring, and it doesn't quite capture what other action RPGs bring. It just feels like it's a little off from both of those and not necessarily in the best way. Although one thing I do want to say that I love, because unlike Soulsborne games, you can pause, like actually really pause anytime you want, although it takes a couple of button presses to get there, which is weird. But I do like that, plus pausable cutscenes is always a bonus. Now let's get into the controls, and I'm going to complain about how they're mapped a bit, but overall I will say they function fairly well. They are responsive. I didn't have any problems with my characters not going where I wanted or not doing what I not necessarily wanted, but what I pressed the button to do. So the controls were very responsive, and the reason I point that out is there were times where I was definitely like swung 3 or 4 times, and then I hit that oh shit moment, I need to dodge, but if you swing 4 times, you're swinging 4 times. You can't dodge in the middle of that. That's on your ass, you know? But my complaint with the mapping is there are certain things that are tied to like the right trigger. You may accidentally trigger your character's ability rather than their special attack. And I just think having those 2 things mapped to the same button is obnoxious, because you may not mean to use that ability. Like when I was the Berserker, I would accidentally trigger the Berserk mode when I meant to use my special attack or added attack, whatever you want to call it. I think they really needed to figure a better way of mapping that. They just made some weird mapping choices that I do think negatively impact the controls and therefore the gameplay. Now let's get into the graphics and visuals, and the first thing you will notice is that this is very clearly not, I mean obviously it wasn't developed by, but it doesn't even look like a Square Enix game. I mean design-wise, yes, but like graphically, not even close. I don't think this looks anywhere near as good as like Final Fantasy VII. So you notice that like immediately. But I will say, I think there's a lot of things that they do capture the Final Fantasy vibe. Definitely creature design. I think the creature design really captures what you would see in a Final Fantasy in a third-person world. Stuff that you wouldn't have seen in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. So I do appreciate that and I like that. Overall, I really enjoy the visual style. I will say that. Even though there are, again, some weird things, because as I mentioned, there's some weird things going on visually, like your character has earbuds. And I mean, they only pop up in one scene, but it's very oddly noticeable, and you're sitting there going, well, that's weird. And like all the characters, like generic clothes, have like sneakers, and it looks just really weird and out of place, and they do kind of explain it in the story, but still, it's just weird. But let's get back to it. Beyond the monster design, I actually like the armor and weapons, and I like the visuals of the spells. I think all of that is brought to life in a really fantastic way. Like when you throw on some of those armors, you're like, I 100% could see this in a classic Final Fantasy game. I think it fits so very well. I also like the areas you go to, although I should point out, and this kind of is gameplay-ish, but it's not like one connected world. You have a like world map and you bounce around from mission to mission. But that being said, each of the areas you go to, I actually like the design of them. I like the way they flow, and I think they fit very well with you know, the theme of the area. I think the creatures in there, they work well. I just like the overall visual style of this game, even though it may not be the most graphically impressive game. Despite bearing the Final Fantasy name, it does not look as good as, you know, you would expect a Final Fantasy game to look. Although I did run into a couple of spots where the frame rate dipped just a little, but this not being quite as challenging as a classic Soulsborne, it wasn't as detrimental, and it generally didn't happen in combat, interestingly enough. So to wrap this up, this game just overall feels a little off. It doesn't feel like it captures the Soulsborne elements that it's going for, and it doesn't feel like it captures the Final Fantasy elements it's going for. And overall, I don't necessarily love this game, but I don't hate this game. I don't hate that I own this game, and I will definitely come back to playing this game at some point. But I also cannot tell anyone that I fully recommend this game. I don't think that it's 100% worth all your money, you know? So I will say, if you are like a die-hard Final Fantasy fan and you like Soulsborne style games, it's worth picking up at like $40, $50, somewhere around there, not quite full price. But if you're not a die-hard Final Fantasy fan, then you will find better Soulsborne style games elsewhere. There's plenty of them. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, have you seen that Exo Primal trailer? I don't know what the fuck Capcom's thinking with that one. I'm just not sure on it. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.